Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, his mercy endures forever. Welcome back to another episode of Faith Matters with Phillip Campbell, Catholic variety program broadcasting on Good Shepherd Catholic Radio in Jackson, Michigan. I am the aforementioned Phillip Campbell, your host, your traveling companion, the voice on the other end of the radio for the next half hour. Christmas time. Christmas is universally acclaimed as people's favorite holiday. Most people cherish Christmas memories of visits home, brightly decorated trees, and beautiful snowy landscapes. Well, at least if you live in the Midwest like I do, you get the snowy landscapes. Now, just like we may remember certain Christmases from days gone by, so the history of our church and our civilization has had some notable Christmases. One of the most notable of these Christmases was Christmas Day of the year 800 AD, for this was the date that King Charles the Great of the Kingdom of the Franks was crowned emperor by Pope Leo III. Well, so what? There's been many royal and imperial coronations in European history. What made this one on Christmas Day of the year 800 so special? Now, this event, this royal coronation, was probably the single most important moment in Europe between the fall of Rome and the Protestant Reformation. Indeed, the coronation of Charles by Pope Leo was fundamental in establishing the contours of medieval and even modern Europe. Now, in this program, we're going to take a look at this coronation and why I think the coronation of Charles the Great by Pope Leo was so important. We're going to look at the Pope's motivation in crowning him, the short and long-term results of renewing the imperial title in the West. Indeed, there's been few events in the Church's history and in European history with such far-reaching consequences. So buckle up, because for the next half hour, we are going to epically nerd out with some serious history. Now, we need to start back in the remote past. Let's go back to the late 3rd century and the waning days of the Roman Empire, in the old days when the smoke of animal sacrifices still wafted up from the bloody altars of pagan temples, and Christians were a despised minority in an empire that persecuted them. Way back in the time of the Roman Emperor Diocletian, who was the famous persecutor of so many of our venerated martyrs, the Roman Empire was divided into two halves, the East and the West. Well, more specifically into 4 parts, but the East and the West were the two principal divisions of the empire, each ruled by its own emperor, who were supposed to work together on legal and defensive matters pertaining to the good of the whole Roman Empire. Now, why was the empire divided in half? There was 2 reasons: to provide the empire with a stable plan of succession that had been racked by civil war for 50 years, but also to make the government of the sprawling empire more manageable by breaking it up into smaller chunks. Now, this plan was ultimately a failure, and by 325, our first Christian emperor, Constantine, had centralized all the power under a single ruler and moved the capital to his new city of Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. While the succession problem was temporarily solved as Constantine's dynasty took power, the administrative burdens remained, and the House of Constantine got around this by elevating other members of their family to positions of authority. But that ended up still being too little, and so again, after the end of Constantine's dynasty, the Emperor Theodosius would again split the Roman Empire into 2 sections, East and West, and this time the division was permanent. And it was more than just political. The Eastern Empire was very urbanized. It was Greek-speaking, whereas in the West, the empire was very rural and Latin-speaking. Now, this divide was cultural as well, a divide that would only grow deeper with each passing century, and this divide would find its way into the church also, the divide between the Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East. Now, the 5th century AD was a time of crisis for both halves of the Roman Empire, as barbarian invasions and military rebellions stressed the Roman state on all fronts. But the difference is the Eastern Empire was ultimately able to ride out these challenges and survive for another 1,000 years, and the Western Empire was not. I mentioned that the Western Empire was more rural, with less population density, less wealth, less defensible borders. The Western Empire fell prey to barbarian hordes, and the last Western emperors came to rely too heavily on barbarian mercenaries for their military aid. By the 450s AD, the most important men in the Western Empire were themselves of barbarian or half-barbarian blood. Until finally, in the year 476, a band of mixed barbarian mercenaries, led by their military leader Odoacer, captured the capital of Ravenna and compelled the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, to abdicate. Rather than declaring himself emperor in his place, however, Odoacer just sent the imperial insignia back to the Eastern Roman emperor at Constantinople and said, Italy no longer needs an emperor. We're fed up with emperors. He just took over and gave himself the title King of Italy. And that was the end of the Roman Empire in the West in the year 476. So 476 doesn't necessarily mark the fall of the Roman Empire. It had practically collapsed in the West decades before. But it does represent the extinction of the imperial title in the West, and this is very important to remember. Because while the imperial title in the West went extinct, in the East it continued on as it always had, although eventually the eastern provinces lost their connection to the West, as well as their veneer of Latinization. By the late 6th century, the Eastern Empire had assumed all the characteristics of the medieval Byzantine Empire, which it was transforming into. Its monarchs who ruled from Constantinople spoke Greek, and they no longer took the old title of imperator, that is emperor in Latin, but basileus, which is the Greek word for emperor. Meanwhile, in the West, while the imperial title went extinct, the power of the old Roman Empire passed into a bunch of new barbarian kingdoms: the Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy, the Visigothic kingdom of Spain, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of England, a whole hodgepodge of kingdoms in Germany. So all over the place, these barbarians were setting up their own distinct kingdoms. Some of them, like in Italy, were governed by Arians, because the Ostrogoths were Arians. But the most important of these new barbarian kingdoms was France, and France is really at the heart of our story. Now, France at this time was under the power of the Kingdom of the Franks, who had converted to Christianity around 497 with the famous conversion of their king Clovis, whose dynasty was called the Merovingians. Now, the Frankish church had some of the greatest intellectual luminaries of early medieval Christianity. But the Merovingian government was another story. The church might have been in good shape, but the Merovingian government of the Franks left a lot to be desired. They were not the most competent rulers, and their kings waned in power until the most powerful men in the realm were not the kings, but the mayors of the palace. The mayor of the palace was like the manager of the royal household, akin to a chief steward, kind of like Joseph was for Pharaoh in the Old Testament. He was his chief steward. The Merovingian kings weakened, and this office became very important, this office of mayor of the palace. And it was held by a single family that claimed this by hereditary right. And they were called the Carolingians. So let's get our Ingians straight. The Merovingians were the kings, the weak kings, and the Carolingians were the mayors of the palace who held the real power. They were the power behind the throne. How important were they? Well, when the Muslims invaded France in the 8th century, it was not to the king whom the Franks looked for aid, but it was to the Carolingian mayor of the palace, Charles Martel, in whom the Franks placed their hope. Martel gathered together his Frankish warriors, and he won a smashing victory over the Moors in 732 at the famous Battle of Tours. This epic battle not only broke the strength of the Muslim conquests, but it established the Franks as the most powerful barbarian kingdom in the West, and Charles Martel as the single most powerful man in Latin Christendom. Now, the Franks would also become powerful allies of the papacy, and we have to talk a bit about the dilemma that the papacy found itself in the early Middle Ages. Now, since the fall of the Roman Empire, central Italy had in practice been governed by the Pope directly as a political ruler. Now, this had always been a very hazardous thing because though the church was an effective administrator of lands, it had very little in the way of military power. I mean, the church doesn't have an army, not a temporal army at least. And if central Italy was threatened, the popes of that day had little recourse other than to just ask for help and hope another political entity would step in to aid them. Until the 8th century, this tended to be the Byzantine emperor, the successor of the old Roman emperors in the East. The Byzantine emperor Justinian once waged a 20-year war in Italy to break the power of the Ostrogoths who were persecuting the church. And there were various other military incursions into the West, usually small and ineffective, because the Byzantines were very wary of getting bogged down in military quagmires in the West. Sometimes they were totally inactive if there was no compelling political advantage to getting involved. During the pontificate of Pope Gregory the Great, which was around 590 to 604, a group called the Lombards were making major military conquests throughout northern Italy, and the Byzantine representative at Ravenna chose to do nothing and simply allowed the Lombards freedom of movement, freedom to rampage throughout Italy at will, compelling the Pope to take matters into his own hands and negotiate a separate peace treaty with the Lombards. And after Gregory solved the problem, the Byzantine official was enraged that the Pope had taken this initiative. Now, what else was he supposed to do? I mean, it's very common that when political authorities either can't or won't exercise their power, people tend to take things into their own hands. So you have a Byzantine government that just simply didn't want to get involved in the affairs of Italy to protect the church. Now, this problem was compounded by the fact that when the Byzantines did choose to intervene, they often tried to exact concessions from the popes regarding the political and supposed ecclesiastical primacy of Constantinople in exchange. In other words, they said, look, we'll help you, Pope, to protect your lands, but we want you to give away some of your powers to the Patriarch of Constantinople or recognize the Patriarch of Constantinople as your superior, etc., which the popes never wanted to do, of course. This sort of thing had been going on for some time, and even worse was when certain heretic Byzantine emperors attempted to try to force the Pope to enforce their edicts in the West, as the iconoclast emperors did when they tried to command the popes to prohibit the use of images in Christian worship, which the popes rightfully condemned as a heresy. So by the mid-700s, the papacy was fairly exhausted by their dealings with Constantinople. Relations with the Byzantines were very poor, and the popes were caught in the middle of a war between the Franks and the Byzantines over territories in southern Italy. So this put the popes in a very difficult spot. They were trying to maintain their traditional ties to the Byzantine court, but this was marred by recurrent heresy, Byzantine inactivity, political pressure, and just the growing cultural divide between the Latin West and the Greek East. The Greek East was getting more and more different culturally from the West, and the West was following its own route of development, and the East and the West had less and less in common with each other. But if the Pope abandoned Rome's ties with Constantinople, where could the Pope turn in times of crisis when military aid was necessary? To whom could he look if not to the Eastern Empire that for generations upon generations had been the natural center of the Roman Christian world? Now, we mentioned in the beginning of this episode that the pivotal moment that we'd be discussing was the coronation of a man named Charles the Great. Now, Charles the Great, also known as Charlemagne, was a Frank, a member of the Carolingian family, that household who had served as the mayors of the palace for the kings of France. He was the grandson of Charles Martel, and after Martel's victory over the Muslims at Tours in 732, the the stature of the Carolingian family was so high, it was so great, that Charles Martel's son Pepin was able to peacefully overthrow the last Merovingian king and assume the kingship of the Franks himself. Now, Pepin's son, Charlemagne, came to the throne in 768, and by that time his family already had a history of strong ties to the papacy. For example, a few years earlier, King Pepin brought his armies into Italy to drive out the Lombards, who were demanding tribute from the Pope. Pepin was successful in this, and he confirmed that the lands of central Italy should be under the exclusive temporal rule of the papacy. Now, this is going to establish the legal framework for the future papal states, and if you didn't know, the popes used to rule over central Italy like an independent kingdom, and they governed this land for almost 1,000 years. I think for over 1,000 years. It was they were not abolished until 1870. Now, this also gave the other barbarian kingdoms a warning that central Italy was off limits and that any violence against the church's holdings would be answered by the Franks. So, this intervention of Pepin established the independence of the church from the meddling of the Lombards, but it also secured Italy's unquestionable independence from the Byzantine Empire and won the Carolingians the goodwill of the popes. Now, the Pope would soon need to put this goodwill to the test. In 799, a Roman mob, stirred up by opponents of the reigning Pope, Leo III, tried to kidnap that Pope. Why did they want to kidnap him? Well, their intentions were pretty nasty. They wanted to poke his eyes out and rip his tongue out of his mouth. I'm not even joking. That's really what they wanted to do, to poke out his eyes and rip out his tongue. Now, this awful plan was not out of mere malice. The intention here was to render the Pope physically incapable of holding his office and thus necessitate his resignation and a new papal election. It was a way to try to get a new Pope. Now, Pope Leo understandably fled from Rome and went to the north, where he was told that Charlemagne was holding court at the German city of Paderborn. Leo presented himself to Charlemagne, and the king was indignant that anyone would dare offer such violence to the Pope. On December 23rd of the year 800, Pope Leo swore that he was innocent of the things he was accused of, and he was escorted back to Rome by Charlemagne and his army. This must have been a very merry procession to see the great king of the Franks, the strongest ruler in Western Europe, escorting the Pope back to Rome at Christmas time so he could celebrate Mass on time in St. Peter's Basilica. Now, since he was in Rome, Charlemagne decided to stick around for the Christmas festivities, and he took the opportunity of hearing Mass, the Christmas Mass in St. Peter's Basilica on Christmas Day of the year 800. Now, during the Mass, Charlemagne goes up and he's praying before the altar. And while he's praying, Pope Leo approached him with a crown and placed it upon his head and declares before all the notable members of the church and the Frankish lords that Charlemagne is now Imperator Romanorum, Emperor of the Romans. No longer King of the Franks, but Emperor of the Romans. Now, Charlemagne later claimed that he had no idea that the Pope intended to crown him, and that had he known, he would not have set foot in the basilica that day. Now, other historians are skeptical of this story, and they say that Charlemagne certainly could not have failed to notice the massive crown sitting on a table beside the altar when he went up there to pray. Well, the motives and the foreknowledge of Charlemagne are known to God alone, but this coronation was of pivotal importance in the history of Christendom and Europe, probably the most monumental event to happen on Christmas Day since the birth of Christ. Why? How did this imperial coronation of Charlemagne affect the development of Europe and the Church? When Charlemagne was crowned Roman Emperor by the Pope that year in 800, his kingship took on a much more sacred identity than any previous European king in the Latin West. The coronation of Charlemagne as Roman Emperor was seen by contemporaries as continuing the line of the imperial tradition of ancient Rome. Thus, Charlemagne was crowned as Emperor and Augustus, as his biographer tells us. Now, this is the beginning of a medieval concept that Christians had called the translatio imperii. This means the translation of the imperial authority, that the highest secular power in Christendom had been transferred from the Byzantines to the house of Charlemagne by the Pope. Now, this idea of transferring the imperial power is of supreme importance because when the Pope crowned Charlemagne and called him emperor, the Pope was not claiming to resurrect the extinct imperial office in the West. Rather, he believed he was translating the imperial title from Constantinople to Charlemagne. You see, at the time, the Byzantine emperor was no emperor at all, but was an empress, the Empress Irene. She is the sole empress in the history of the Roman Empire, East or West. And because of this, she was considered a usurper, because there'd been no custom in the Roman Empire, legal or otherwise, of a woman wielding imperial authority. Irene had succeeded her son to the Byzantine throne, but this succession was not recognized by the Pope nor the Franks, or as one historian put it, Irene, despite all her talents and political savvy, could not quite overcome the disadvantage of being a woman. Her reign was not recognized as valid. So, in the eyes of the Pope and the Franks, the imperial throne was actually vacant, since they didn't recognize Irene's claim to it. So, in giving imperial authority to Charlemagne, the Pope was proclaiming Charlemagne to be the successor of the emperors of Constantinople. Because ultimately, the imperial authority was viewed by Christians of the day as being one authority. Just as there was one church and one God, there was viewed to be one ultimate political authority, the imperial authority. The Pope, as the vicar of Christ, claimed the authority to be able to translate this power back to the West when the line of succession died in the East. And so Charlemagne and his descendants became the imperial authority in Latin Christendom. Now, obviously, the Byzantines vehemently disagreed with the Pope's theory, and the subtleties of this were probably lost on Charlemagne himself. Even so, the bestowal of this power from the hands of the Pope gave Charlemagne new incentive to wield his power as something sanctioned by God, and thus began what might have been the Middle Ages' most intensive and effective political marketing campaign, with the goal of establishing Charlemagne and his house as the God-ordained rulers of a new Roman Empire that's going to ultimately become known as the Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne carried out this project by assembling at his court a vast array of scholars, clerics, and intellectuals from around Europe, partly to consolidate his authority and partly out of a genuine love of learning, scholarship, and all things pertaining to the church. Now, this had profound ramifications for both church and for the Frankish kingdom. It had benefits and it had drawbacks. On the one hand, the popes finally had a defender upon which they could depend. The Frankish dominions extended right into Italy, and as long as it endured, the Carolingian kingdom was faithful to the arrangement of Charlemagne. This ultimately meant that Italy and the papacy became westward looking. Instead of turning to the east and the court of Byzantium, they pivoted west, casting their lot in with the French. Have you ever thought about why Italy is smack dab right down the middle of Europe, but it's always lumped in with Western Europe, not Eastern Europe? I mean, it could go either way. It could be west or east geographically, but we think of Italy as a Western European country. This is because in the early 9th century, the popes made a determined decision to look to the west to be part of the affairs of Western Europe by yoking themselves to the kingdom of Charlemagne. Now, this also granted a kind of divine sanction and aura on the sanctity of Charlemagne. His legacy in France and all of Europe was immense. All future Christian kings would look back on Charlemagne in some way or another as an exemplar of a Christian king. Charles, the lawgiver, Charles, the protector of local rights and charters. Charles is the ancestor of every great noble house. Charles even was venerated as a saint in some times. He's not been canonized, but he was venerated at some points. Now, these conceptions show how much the destiny of the French and the German people really turned upon his influence and achievements. Even if we look at the map of Europe today, Europe as we know it, the map today goes back to the divisions of the Carolingian kingdom stemming from Charles' time, from his grandsons and how they divided up his territories. But on the other hand, the coronation of Charlemagne meant that the imperial authority of the West would always be in some way beholden to the Pope. This would eventually lead to problems. A few centuries later, when the imperial authority passed from Charlemagne to the house of Otto the Great and the Germans, no emperor could claim the imperial title unless it was conferred by the Pope. And if the Pope disapproved of an emperor's actions, the emperor-elect might have his imperial coronation held up or even denied, as was the case with Frederick II, who became king in 1196, but was not crowned emperor until 1220, a full 24 years later. So imperial coronation could become a sort of political tool in the strife between the papacy and the empire that characterized the High Middle Ages. Now, the popes, too, experienced negative ramifications from this arrangement, inaugurated on Christmas Day in the year 800. By wedding themselves to the kingdom of the Carolingians, the popes implicitly acknowledged that these rulers had a special right to meddle in the affairs of the church by virtue of their special guardianship over the pope. You even had a Holy Roman Emperor, Otto I, who would take advantage of this by claiming the right to even choose the pope. And this led to all sorts of problems and strife, conflict between the popes and the Holy Roman emperors over what was the role of the emperor, what authority did he have over the church. It was incredibly destructive and sowed the seeds of a lot of secular antagonism to the papacy that would rear up in centuries to come. But that was all still a long way off. On that happy day in the year 800, on Christmas Day, the imperial coronation of Charlemagne by the Pope secured his place as the greatest of all Christian monarchs, gave his rule popular support he needed to extend his dominions across Europe, and thus carved out the boundaries of the European kingdoms as we know them today. All students of Catholic history, or just European history, should have Christmas Day of the year 800 anchored in their minds as one of the most important moments in Christendom. Well, is that enough for now, or should we throw out some more names and dates? Well, this is only a very small story in the great mosaic of Western history. Perhaps we'll explore more in future episodes. But until then, this has been Faith Matters. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift his countenance upon you and give you peace. God bless.